Heart of Atlanta Motel, Pickricks, any of those, Rich's Department Store, what kind of memories you have about boycotting those institutions?
Well, Richards was ground zero for the movement. That was our first test experience, and Dr. King joined us there. Otis Moss also, and I have also memories of our sleep-ins at the hotels and kneel-ins. I led a kneel-in at White First Baptist, where Charles Stanley is still there. He was the assistant pastor when I led the demonstration with students from Georgia Tech, Morehouse, and Spelman. And students were literally picked up and thrown out of that church by the deacons and trustees. In fact, that's where I met my wife, right there on the steps of the church. She couldn't get in, but I was down front with one other student because I knew the floor mat of the church, and they were just coming on television then, back in the day, and they didn't want to have too much of a commotion down front. But the students who were sitting in the back of the church, I repeat, were picked up and literally thrown out of that church. And still today, the Southern Baptists have a lot more to do to be like Jesus when it comes to the issue of race. Just a few days ago, they dismembered a black church that happens to have elected a woman to be the pastor. And it concerns me greatly. The Southern Baptists have not been with us on social justice issues. They're given a lot of lip service. They said they're sorry about what happened in 1845 when they organized Southern Baptist Convention in Augusta, Georgia, over the issue of slavery, but they haven't shown fruits of repentance. And if you're repentant, you should be concerned about social justice, about health care, about education, about jobs, about all of those entities and measures that will enable people to experience the summum bonum, the good life. And that's where they fall short.
What do you recall as it relates to Hurt Park? There's a pilgrimage from Hurt Park.
That came later. Hurt Park came later. I was not involved at Hurt Park because I moved around the state from Atlanta. I led a wade-in at Tybee Beach, Georgia, in 1961. You couldn't even swim on the beach there at Tybee Beach, Georgia. And I did summer youth work for NAACP throughout the Southeast region, back down to my native state of Mississippi, where I was one of the Freedom Riders also, and led protests against segregation at parks in Jackson, Mississippi.
Tell me a little bit about the Freedom Rides. What do you remember? Any events that stand out in your mind?
Well, I was not on the same bus with the group that went to Anniston in the bus during the Freedom Rides. I was the loner. I left Atlanta alone and was arrested when I got to Jackson. It was an experience that was lonely. One was fearful, but I guess we were too crazy to be scared, really. And I just think back that I could have been with Swarner, Goodman, and Cheney. Had it not been for the fact that I decided that I would stay in Atlanta and go later. Mr. Evers, Mega Evers, had called me and asked me to come to be a part of the summer student movement, the summer of 1964. So I'm thankful to God that I was able to make my contribution, and I'm still alive, because many of my friends did not survive in the struggle. And then I thank God that I stayed close again to my elders, stayed close to the NAACP. Why? Because many of those who were veterans, civil rights workers, I feel experienced some post-traumatic stress syndromes. We need each other. It's one thing we need today. We need more of a sense of community. This rugged individualism of Western philosophy and thought is detrimental to the advancement of an oppressed people. We need to master that pronoun of we. There were periods when we did have it in our segregated schools, but when integration came along, we thought that this was the utopia, this was the day of heaven, but our dreams, to use the words of Dr. King, were turned into nightmares because we were not accepted when we got to the stop of the bus in these integrated schools. Many of our communities have become gentrified, and consequently, many of our black institutions have been destroyed because of that gentrification. Whereas other groups, ethnic groups particularly, recent groups, immigrant groups, whom we welcome, have always maintained their enclaves, their watering holes, their places to come together. And the last semblance that I feel we have of that is in the black church, these black colleges. Other than that, our communities have been destroyed. And that's why many of our young people are turning to drugs and all other kinds of destructive devices because they are alone. And I hope and pray that we can bring about what I call the recreation of community through deliberately reaching out and seeing that it's no crime, it's not sinful, there's nothing wrong with working together as a people.
Do you, it's very powerful. What do you remember or recall, if anything, about Grady Memorial Hospital and the experiences there?
Grady Memorial Hospital, a segregated place that was supposed to have been a place for healing, help, and hope. But for us, it was a place of horror. And many blacks died before the deadline because they were neglected in the emergency room. I have heard of many horror stories of leaders of our communities and regular citizens who died untimely deaths because they would not show intentional concern for a black person who was injured or sick.
I heard they had different ambulances.
Yes.
What do you recall about the quadrangle as sort of like as a meeting point for marches and things of that nature?
Yes, the quadrangle.
Let me fix something real quick before you get into this.
Okay.
Reflection. That was cool. All right, cool. Yep.
Yes, the quadrangle was a sacred space. It was a meeting place. And I can see back in the day when we met there in front of Trevor Arnett Library. By the way, also, Mr. Julian Bond's mother was a librarian in that library. But we gathered there and we mapped out our strategies. We went through role plays. And after we met, prayed, and we sang, we were fired up and ready to go and to accept anything. So I also have pictures of that spot that are very dear to me.
Where is that?
Right there at, where Harkness Hall is, right there near Morehouse's Central Campus, as they call it, where they have graduation exercise. That was a spot right there.
So like with Clark and.
Yes, yes. And we also had meetings in Yates and Milton Drugstore
Tell me about that.
and Pascal's.
What?
Those are the two places where we met, Pascal's, Yates and Milton, and the Quadrangle. Yes.
For mass meetings, but also like organizing as
Well, we had mass meetings in the Quadrangle, but in terms of strategy sessions, we met in the drugstore and also at Rush Memorial Church, Congregational Church. That was another meeting place there in the back. And we spent many hours there. Many even slept there when we had to work through the night before going out the next day for demonstrations.
well. Talk about some of the churches and the support, from Rush Memorial to have Wheat Street Baptist Church, Friendship Baptist Church, to any of those.
Oh, yes, indeed. Well, one vivid memory I have of Warren Memorial over on Ashby is that some of the leaders of our movement had made a blunder of negotiating with the power structure of the city that broke faith with what the students had agreed to do in terms of the demonstrations. And that night, people were very tense, they were angry. And Dr. King showed up at the meeting. In the midst of all of the anger and the turmoil, he stood up, and I never shall forget it. He said, we must keep our eyes on the bigger things and on the prize. He said, somebody has done something that they shouldn't have done, but I liken our situation unto a football game. He said, whenever you really want to have a winning team, even if you're out on the gridiron and somebody fumbles the ball, you don't go to the sideline and argue and point fingers about who fumbled the ball. Someone has sense enough to retrieve the ball and run a touchdown anyhow. And he said, we must make a touchdown for justice. We must make a touchdown for equality in Atlanta. And he went on and alliterated. And boy, he got the house that night, and people were smiling and saying, we're going to make a touchdown after he spoke. And then I recall Friendship Baptist Church, where I did my student field work there under Dr. Samuel W. Williams, who was president of the Atlanta branch of NACP. Friendship, that historic church, was the place where we got our minds sharpened. Sam Williams taught philosophy and religion, and he always cautioned us to make sure that we would be able to give a reason for the hope that was in us. And he also appealed to us to be articulate and to state your case and make the world respect you because you're able to define yourself in the movement, even with the language of your oppressors, without feeling the pinch and the sting of the oppression. And of course, you know that Morehouse, when he came from Augusta to Atlanta, had his first class there. Spelman was founded in the basement. Atlanta University came out of a boxcar, and their classes were held there in Friendship Church. And Maynard Jackson's father was pastor of that church. Dr. Carter, who was pastor of that church for 62 years, was one of the first blacks to go to the Holy Land back in the 1880s. And he was a graduate of Morehouse. I think that we must do all that we can to keep that history alive. And as the Jews would do, tell it to generations following. And I'm very concerned. I know the decision's been made, but that church was torn down for what I consider a C-minus team, well, a dome. I believe in progress and all that, but there are some things that are just sacred, and Friendship Church is a sacred spot. So I hope, given the decision has been made, I respect it, that we can recoup the loss of that historical presence right there and keep repeated instances of telling the story. And that's why we need what I call rituals of remembrances. Not once a year for Black History Month, but we ought to have it every week, like the Jews do. The Feast of the Passover, every Friday night, the old man sits at one end of the table and the youngest child sits at the other end, and the others are gathered around, and the youngest child raises the question, "Daddy, what means this night?" Daddy goes on to tell the story. This means that your forebears were liberated from enslavement in Egypt's land, and gives other explanations of what happened. We must get back to that. We must replicate that as a people and not be a cut flower generation. We need to always stay intact and in touch with our roots and the best of our traditions.